Okay, welcome to the Workplace Therapy Podcast, where we talk about the realities of working together and healing together. My name's Scott Arrieta. I'm the CEO of Unity & Company. We're the experts that market-leading brands rely on to unify their leadership teams and catalyze cultural transformation. I'm joined today by Monica Arrieta, who's our head of coaching and transformation here at Unity & Company. And we are delighted to introduce you to our guest today, Nadine Fakhoury. Nadine is an executive coach and founder of Insight Coaching Solutions. She helps leaders to successfully navigate today's complex workplace. Drawing on nearly 2 decades of corporate leadership experience, including her role as an executive at Cisco, leading a global team of 350 and managing over $8 billion in annual revenue, Nadine uniquely understands the intricacies of senior leadership challenges. She specializes in partnering with clients to lead authentically, remain grounded in their values, and create meaningful impact, guiding them towards both professional success and personal fulfillment. As the only female VP in a global organization of 7,000 professionals and a first-generation immigrant, she deeply appreciates the resilience required and the nuanced dynamics of diversity in global workplaces. Nadine earned her MBA from Duke University and holds dual bachelor's degrees in computer engineering and electrical engineering from North Carolina State University. She's currently completing an executive certificate in leadership coaching at Georgetown University. And committed to giving back, Nadine serves on the board of an educational nonprofit, actively contributing her expertise to initiatives benefiting local children. Based in San Francisco, she enjoys podcasts, pickleball, photography, traveling, having visited over 30 countries, and spending time outdoors with her husband and her 2 children. Nadine, we are so delighted to have you here on the podcast today.
Thank you, Scott. I'm really excited to be here.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and start with your story because I think it's a fascinating one that's going to resonate with a lot of our listeners. So you spent over 20 years in tech, rising to become the first and only female VP in your group. So what did that journey look like for you? And ultimately, what led you to pivot into executive coaching?
So where should I begin? I guess, just at the beginning, I started off, like you mentioned, I started off as an engineer at Cisco. I had actually gone through a year-long training program with a cohort of other people, kind of like myself, early in career people. And that was a great experience. But at the end of it, they deployed us, so to speak, into what they called the fields. You go to different offices across the country. And for me, I ended up in the state of Maryland at that time. So, one of the key themes that I started to see early in my career is how I was the only, right, in different categories. On my first team, I was the only early in career individual on the team. When I first joined, there was actually another woman who kind of took me under her wing, who I was very thankful for. But then she retired and I found myself being the only female on the team for a number of months as well. And that was a humbling experience for me because I didn't quite feel comfortable in my skin to begin with. I was new in the corporate world, new to working in general. And here I am in a different state, different, environment. And I very distinctly felt a little alone at times, right? I'm going to pivot a little bit. I actually had the opportunity to become a leader early in my career as well. And that was an incredible experience for me. So I grew up watching my father lead, and I always had this vision that I would want to get into leadership. Maybe I'd want to own a business someday. That's kind of what I thought at that point. The punchline is that's what I'm doing now, right? The opportunity came to me very, very early in my career. And once I became a leader, I was just hooked. I loved it. And I felt like it was my calling for a number of years. From there, I led multiple teams as a first level leader. I decided to go back and get my MBA from Duke. And that MBA program had a huge, profound effect on me. I remember having a conversation with my leader at the time. And he said, Nadine, I have to be honest, I was a little concerned about, working and getting your MBA at the same time because I was concerned that you'd lose focus at work. We really needed your leadership here. And he said, what I saw was completely the opposite. I see a transformation in you. I see you stepping into more confidence as a leader. I see you being more grounded in the decisions you have to make. And he was like, I don't know what that MBA program did for you, but he was like, I'm so thankful you're there. And over time, I did kind of find my voice and started to lead in a way that apparently got me noticed, right? And so I had sponsors who invested in me. I had advocates who helped me all throughout my career. I became a, second line leader, third level leader. And then finally, the last 4 years, I was a fourth level leader and I was promoted to vice president, which at Cisco was executive level. So that's kind of the short snippet of 21 years, the last 21 years. A quick sidebar, back to the theme of only. When I was a director, I distinctly remember this. I had the opportunity to build an incredibly diverse team, leadership team. And at that point, I was a third level leader. And I remember just the synchrony that we had on the team, just how much fun we all had. We had this banter, kind of jokes about sports and, things where sometimes the guys wanted to talk about the sports and the women because I wasn't the only one would jump in and say, okay, we're putting a timer and that's all, that's all the sports talk we can have. And I just remember feeling so inspired being on that team of diverse individuals. At the same time, I was invited to an leadership offsite with one of our partners. And the first thing I noticed was I'm the only woman there. And I just remember being like, oh, wait, this still exists? Like, this still happens? Because I had, at that point, had a number of years of cultivating this diverse team, right? And I walked into day one of that meeting. I didn't know everybody there. I was still meeting a lot of the partners. And this gentleman walked up to me and he just said, excuse me, do you know the agenda for today and where we're going to have a break? And I looked at him and I was like, why would I know that? I'm here as a participant of the invite. He thought I was the admin for the group, which happens to women a lot, especially in, male dominated sectors. But I just remember being like, okay, this bubble that I was a part of is not really what happens all the time. And so when I became a VP, fast forward a little bit, I found myself again being the only, right? And one of the things that happens when you are a vice president, the only female vice president, is you get noticed. And I especially was noticed by a lot of women. And what had happened from there is many of those women started reaching out. They wanted to talk about career advice. They wanted help with a lot of challenging situations that they were facing. They wanted mentorship. They wanted advice. They wanted coaching. Some of them wanted to know how to be me in the future. But what I had recognized is I loved meeting with people in general. And it wasn't just women, I should say. There were a lot of BIPOC professionals that also reached out. And there were men. I mean, there were all kinds of people. But I just saw this trend of the minorities reaching out than not. And I loved it. I loved helping them. And that's ultimately, I think, what led me down this path of coaching.
Oh, there's so much richness in your story, Nadine. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about, you've mentioned that you've been the only one in a lot of these chapters of your career. So how did that shape your experience and your approach to leadership as you were climbing the ranks?
Yeah. At first, I actually didn't even want to acknowledge to myself that I was different in any way. At first, all I wanted to do was blend in. I just wanted to hide and pretend like I'm like these people. I'm going to use sports as one of the analogies. I remember on that first team that I was a part of, we would have every other Friday, we would go out to lunch as a team. And especially when I was in that period of time where I was the only female on the team, the men around the table at lunch would constantly be talking about sports. I mean, nonstop. There was not like a day, there was not a lunch where sports were not spoken about. And I remember I got on the phone with my now husband. He and I were kind of in a long distance relationship at that point. And I said, listen, you've got to teach me about like what is happening with football. They keep talking about the Ravens and I don't even know what any of this stuff is. And just, please help me. And so he'd keep me updated as like with what's happening with the sports team and all that stuff. It was just, he'd keep me updated. And so I'd go to those lunches and I'd be like, yeah, did you see how such and such threw that play? Like, I can't believe blah, blah, blah. And I was literally just trying to get in the conversation, right? And I finally got through the season of football and I was like, oh, thank God, that's over. At the very next lunch, they brought up golf. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this. Like,
Mm-hmm.
because I just naturally didn't care about those things, right?
Sure.
And so it was a trying time for me trying to figure out my place.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember also there was one time where I was invited to a women's roundtable. This was still earlier in my career. And I just remember thinking to myself, I don't know, like, why are we here? I don't get it. I don't want anybody to point out that I'm different. If you don't point out we're different, then, maybe people won't notice it. And I just so desperately wanted to belong, right? That's what I really wanted. And I just wanted to hide. I wanted to I wanted to be them, like them, so that I could belong. And it wasn't until I finally recognized that I was going to be put in a box no matter what I did,
Mm.
that I finally started to change my approach. And I distinctly remember it was when I had gotten an offer. Actually, I was still in the MBA program, Scott. I had gotten an offer to move across the country to California to become a leader, leading a different team here. And I was negotiating my salary. And they gave me the first offer. I had looked at the cost of living differences. I did a ton of research, like brought up like graphs and numbers and all this stuff to try to present to the hiring manager to show him why the raise that they gave me was not sufficient. And his statement after I went through this whole, kind of presentation and everything, his statement was, well, you're getting a decent increase. Besides, isn't your husband going to look for a job? You guys
Mm-mm.
will be fine.
Mm-mm.
And number one, I was shocked because I was like, I don't even know what to say to that. And thankfully, my instinct kicked in. And I said, would you ask me that question if I was a man negotiating my
Mm.
salary? I ended up getting more of a raise after that. But that was the defining moment for me
Mm-hmm.
because I genuinely couldn't. I was like, I can't escape this. And so what I ended up doing from that day on is I realized my voice was needed and my authentic voice was needed as a leader. And so I started to be very intentional about how I led, right? I was intentional about hiring. I was intentional about sponsoring. I was intentional about developing. I was intentional as I looked across the whole system of how I can make a difference in the corporate world as a leader. And I did it one team at a time. And then later I did it I did it broader than that.
Mm.
I love that story, Nadine, because, one of the things that really stands out to me about it is, I mean, you spoke and advocated for yourself in different ways. You used words when necessary, and you used actions also, right? So, directly confronting the salary offer and directly asking that question, I think, is just such an inspiring example of what we should feel more empowered to do when we find ourselves in salary negotiations, really kind of calling things out right on its face. But something that you mentioned earlier that I want to zoom in on is you had mentioned that you'd fallen in love with leadership very early on. And that one of the things that you instinctually did was compose and develop teams that looked nothing like the general composition of teams elsewhere within the organization. And as you grew through the organization and eventually culminating in your role as a vice president, you used your platform to advocate for these underrepresented voices, which I think speaks so loudly. So I would love for you to just share some stories. When we were first kind of discussing what we would talk about on this podcast, you told me a story of a team offsite that you created for technical women. And I'd love for you to recount that story here and just kind of go into why it was such a powerful moment for your team.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. If it isn't clear to anybody listening to this, women in technical roles are a minority. And this is
Mm-hmm.
across the tech industry. This is pretty standard. And so talked about being the only, but there were a lot of women across a lot of teams that were the only across the company. When I had taken on my position leading the last team, 350 or so professionals, global team, one of the things that I quickly realized was the numbers were looking pretty grim when it came to diversity across the board. And so it was just eating up at me, especially having left a team in a different organization where at least within my purview, our numbers were just kind of, we set the standard, right? It still could have been better, don't get me wrong. But compared to a lot of other teams out there, we set the standard of what could be possible. And so it really just ate at me. And I decided to pull together a few of my senior leaders who were women. And I cared about diversity in different lenses, by the way. I know I talk a lot about women, but at some point I recognized that if I'm the sole female, BIPOC female in in the organization, I have to put a stance somewhere. Like if I can't do something, who's going to do it?
Mm.
And so back to these women, I pulled them together and I said, hey, I want your help and advice. You've been in this group longer than I have. How do we cultivate the talent that we need? How do we retain the talent that we need? What do we do? What are some actionable things that you recommend that we do to move the needle? And so they went off and huddled and, kind of investigated some things, and they came back and they had some actionable kind of recommendations. But one of them was, Nadine, we really think an offsite for all of us would be very valuable. And I was like, yeah, that would be really nice. Yeah, that's a great idea. Now, we were facing budget, there's always this like, how can we cut our budget and how can we make sure that we're not overspending, and all the money that we had needed to be used responsibly towards customer activities and that sort of thing. And so I kind of dismissed the idea. They came back again, maybe a few weeks later, and said, Nadine, we really need an offsite. And I was like, yeah, I know. It would be really nice, wouldn't it? It would be really nice. And so again, I sort of dismissed it. And then they came back again and they said, no, really, we need you to champion for an offsite. And I was like, wait, one, who needs to go champion for this? You're asking me to go champion for this. And it wasn't even clicking with me. And that's where I held this responsibility of, what does it really mean to be the only leader in this position? It means that people need you to go do something, to go advocate for people. And it clicked in my head that that's what they were asking me to do, because they were like, we can't do it. Like you can do it. And so I did. I went and I had a great relationship with my skip level boss at the time, who led all of the Americas. And so I reached out to her at an event, a customer event, and I just pulled her aside and I was like, hey, I'm thinking of doing this thing. I really would like to pull all the women in my organization and really focus on retention. And she said, well, why stop there? If you're going to do it, you need to do it across all of the Americas. And I was like, okay, that would be great. Like, could you support me with the budget? Because I don't have it. And she was like, write me a business plan. And that's what I did. I pulled together a group of people. And it was Americas and global, actually had people globally that joined. And it turned out to be 130 attendees. Only 10 people declined because they had vacations scheduled, not because of anything else, which is an incredibly high attendance rate. And it was just, I don't know how to describe the magic that happened at that offsite. What became very apparent to me as I was there was this offsite was more needed than even I realized for a lot of the women. It's never been done before for technical women, first of all, in our organization. So that in itself was a novelty. But the range of experiences of people that we had at the offsite ranged from early in career technical women to late stage career, people who are thinking about retirement soon, and everything in between. I'm so confident that every attendee at that offsite walked away with feeling empowered, feeling like they had made connections, feeling like they finally found a place where they belonged, finding a support system. I had women that came up to me who said, I was really thinking of leaving the company because I just felt so alone, or I didn't know how to navigate this problem. And because of this offsite, or because of meeting such and such person, I got the advice that I needed. I had the camaraderie that I needed. I got the support. We had these real talk sessions as a part of the offsite. One of the things I wanted to make sure that I did was it couldn't be surface level, right? There's not going to be like some training or whatever that was there. The purpose was to get deep and to walk away inspired and empowered. And so we had these real talk sessions where we had different topics that contributed to and brainstormed what was top of mind. Everything we're told were not technical enough to tough scenarios that happened to them, right? People were brave and shared some of those things. And it was so powerful because those stories started to come out, and the people who were kind of leading those sessions, they themselves were vulnerable and shared those stories. But then you started to see in, the people in that room, they started to come up with their own stories and share it openly. And it felt therapeutic. I mean, it really felt like therapy in some ways, and it was so needed. And we shared those things not to pity ourselves, but again, just to feel empowered, of like to help people feel empowered, and that goal was achieved. So I'd say by the end of the week, we really raised the resilience level of those women. We helped connect them to other people in the room. We helped create a support system. And at the end of the day, those are the things that matter when you're operating in a system that doesn't always make you feel like you belong.
Yeah, I think that that's such a powerful story, Nadine, for a few reasons, right? Because I mean, first of all, in the container that you created for those women in that organization, probably for the first time in many of their careers, they felt like there was a forum where they could be themselves, where they didn't have to self-censor, where they could talk about their experiences in a way that would be accepted and validated and potentially even shared by other women in the room. And I think that's the difficulty when you're working in non-diverse teams and you're looking to your left and you're looking to your right and you're not really seeing anybody who looks like you, sounds like you, comes from a similar background or lived experiences as you. And so creating that environment, I think, is just powerful in and of itself. Even if there was zero agenda, it would be powerful from that perspective. But the other thing that I kind of want to highlight for you here is you mentioned a lot inclusivity, belonging, and what I'll add to the conversation is trust and psychological safety. So a mutual classmate of ours, Jay Kerway, was on the podcast a few months back, right? And he talked about Amy Edmondson, who's a researcher out of Harvard, who is the foremost mind on trust and psychological safety. And so we talk about that a lot on the Workplace Therapy podcast because it just seems to be a blind spot for most organizations, and that you can have people who are very technically astute, very good at what they do, and yet you'll only capture a fraction of the value that they can truly bring to you if you do not invest in creating trust and psychological safety. And it's hard to feel trusting and psychologically safe in an environment where you don't see yourself well represented. When you enter rooms, you're entering rooms and conversations that seem deliberately exclusionary to you and your lived experience, right? And you have all these micro moments where people are mistaking you for administrative assistants when in reality you're really, high-ranking leaders and managers. And so I do think it's just so instructive and so illustrative for us to see the way that you navigated that as a senior leader, the conversations that you initiated, the advocacy and the belief that you had after participating in that. And I do think that we'll have some listeners in the audience who are really debating, what is it that I can do with my privilege? What is it that I can do with my position? What is it that I can do with my lived experience from an advocacy perspective? Because in the absence of formal sponsorship, it takes people like you to start those conversations. And the impact is multiplicative. I mean, hundreds of women now for the first time having this experience within this massive world-class organization, right? So it's not like this organization is not skilled at getting value out of people, but there's still much more value to be had there by just seeing your people as people and engaging with them as such. So I really, really appreciate that.
And Scott, if I could add one more thing, and this is really powerful and something I'd like to share, which is one of the things we also did at that offsite was invite all my peers who were men to join us at certain points of that offsite, and to take their teams who were there and have open and honest conversations to hear from them. And I have to tell you, the power that it creates when those leaders actually care and start actioning on that feedback. I have to commend especially one of my peers at the time. He was beside himself hearing these stories. He had no idea that this was going on in his organization. And I saw him just create this transformation within his organization where he was like, this is unacceptable when I'm not standing for this as a leader. And he started to take action. And so my point in sharing that is we actually don't need people like me, like advocating. Like that's why it took me so long, because I didn't want to be the woman who's advocating for women. I wanted everybody to advocate for women. I wanted everybody to advocate for BIPOC. I wanted everybody to advocate for LGBTQ. Like, it's just, I see it as a human rights issue, if that makes sense. Like, we all should be advocating for all humans. And so what I implore for leaders to do is take an interest. Like, even if it's just one group, take an interest, hear out those people in the organization, pull them aside to ask them what their experience is like, and then go action, take action based on their feedback.
Yeah.
That's so good.
I think that's such
So
a great
good.
perspective, Nadine. And, as it pertains to my interpretation of what you're saying is allyship, right? So even if you don't find yourself in a group that's been historically marginalized or underrepresented within your organization, in some cases that actually provides you an even more powerful opportunity to get involved and stand up and use your platform to add momentum and weight behind, the perspectives and needs of other people organizationally. There is a question that I want to ask, because I think there's an elephant in the room, so to speak. We've talked a lot about diversity and inclusion and belonging, and DEI as a concept has been heavily politicized as of late. And what my interpretation in talking with internal decision makers is, even if there is a very deep conviction, DEI actually produces superior business outcomes, which it does. It's well researched. That's not really arguable at this point. What's happening is a lot of organizations are finding themselves feeling frozen or a little bit paralyzed in how do we throw weight and support behind DEI-based initiatives or DEI-based actions without necessarily losing the room by calling it a specific thing, right? So I'm wondering if you have any perspective or advice for leaders who find themselves wanting to advocate for the benefits of creating spaces that you've created, advocating in the ways that you've created, but find themselves navigating ambiguous waters of, do I have the company support or sponsorship in order to do this, or will this attract unwanted attention towards me?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've been talking to people across different industries, and what I see is inconsistencies in how companies are handling this. Everything from, this changes nothing for us. Maybe we'll call our DE&I leader a different name, right? Like, change the title. I've seen that a lot. Let's just change it to inclusion, or just head of social corporate responsibility, or, something like that. But the actions inside the company still look very similar to what they had before. And then there are some that, oh, well, we don't want to get in trouble. And so, like, we need to just stifle all this stuff. I think at the end of the day, I don't believe a single manager's actions of taking care of their people, being intentional about the talent they bring in, how they retain their team. That's just basic good leadership, is the way that I see it. And so if somebody still has an interest, and I would hope that more people than not have an interest in this topic still, regardless of the politicized view on the topic. If you have a daughter, if you have a sister, if you just think about it again, to me, it's on the human level. How do you want them to be treated in the workplace? What kind of environment do you want them to work in the future, if our children, so to speak? And that, to me, should be the guiding light. It's just about, are you treating people well? Are you helping to elevate great talent? Are you helping for people to feel connected to their work, connected to their teams? And it doesn't frankly matter what gender that person is, what background they have. But what does matter is that the lens that they bring is unique, and highlighting that and helping people understand that is your responsibility as a leader.
So let's talk a little bit about misalignment. You had told us before that you had reached a point in your career where you felt a little bit out of step with your values, especially during these repeated layoff cycles that you were involved in. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you and what you did to navigate that and eventually overcome it?
Yeah, the last few years of my time in corporate was challenging in many ways. I started to see what they call corporate politics unfold. I started to find myself in the middle of, a lot of politics to the point that it felt like when making some of those decisions, I brought up, Monica, you brought up layoffs, and I did find myself in positions where I was a decision maker in a few layoff cycles. I had to make decisions at times, ones that I didn't agree with. And that's what
Right.
felt like I was misaligned with my values. Those are the ones I struggled with the most, right? There's only so much that a leader can do when those decisions are being kind of made at a higher level of you and you're being
Mhm.
asked to execute. And so I had gone to bat with my leadership team around specific situations. And I did ultimately help save some people that were just great talent, right? To keep. But the toll that it took on me was pretty heavy, I have to say. And that was, I think, when I started to realize, I mean, there's this little nagging voice in my head over time. It wasn't just a one-time thing, but over time, layoffs was a cycle. I'm seeing the corporate politics around me. It felt like there's just too much. I'm sorry to say, just there's some bad behavior by leaders that I was seeing, in certain spots. Not everybody, but it just felt like to me that number one, I started to experience severe burnout.
Mm.
I was irritable with my family. I couldn't be present in joyful moments, if that makes sense. And so there's a couple things that I did to get over that. Number one is I still stuck to trying to be as authentic as I could be,
Mhm.
knowing that I couldn't always share information with people on my team. And instead of outright pretending like nothing was happening when people on my team were like, I had directors on my team who were like, is something happening? Is like that we don't know about yet? And I couldn't get myself to say, to sit and lie. Right. And I just said, look, as well as I do that even if I knew something, I can't say something. And that was enough for them to understand,
Mm.
but it felt more in alignment with my values. So I just started to walk the line of how do I navigate this complex situation in a way that still felt true to myself, knowing that I had some constraints and barriers. I can't outright talk to my team about these decisions. I can't outright tell them what I've been doing, right? But I can not lie to them if I'm asked.
Right.
I can tell them I'll be transparent with you when I can be. And then when we actually did we went through and we actually read everybody in and went through the workforce reductions, the change management after that, the why after that. It was so important to me that people see the a lot of these decisions were being made with the best of intentions, if that makes sense, of where we were going. But like I said, I grappled with it a lot. One of the things that I was very fortunate for is I actually had a coach that I had been working with before this started happening. And so I had established a relationship with her and she became a little bit of my sounding ground. And she helped me come to terms with that misalignment that I had.
Yeah.
But I have to say, over time, the culmination of everything, it just started to put this nagging voice in my head around, is this really what you want to do? Is
Mm.
this really the path that you want to work on or in? I started to feel like I was living out somebody else's idea of a career.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I realized I was no longer having fun. Wow, the leadership. I just had so much fun leading teams. And here I was. And I looked around and I was like, I don't know who I'm doing this for anymore. I don't even know who's navigating my career anymore because it sure wasn't me. I wasn't in the driver's seat anymore.
I mean, as soon as those words escaped your lips, maybe even a little bit before, like my soul just felt the full weight of what you were saying,
Mm.
because I do think that for a lot of us who have made our way into the executive suite, we've asked ourselves that question or we've said those words to ourselves from time to time. And I think it's just indicative of the fact that burnout is just such a theme for everybody in the workplace today, but especially for senior leaders who are having to adopt and be the face of things that are out of alignment with like who they are. And so you have this kind of like duality of responsibilities, your responsibility to be authentic and true to yourself, and your responsibility to be a leader in the way that it's defined by your organization. So Simon Sinek actually talks about this a lot. And he says that burnout isn't just about like the amount of hours that you work. It's about working that amount of hours out of alignment with your own values and your own goals. So this is obviously an example of one of those times where you've experienced that. Do you have other instances where you experienced that personally? And more importantly, I'm interested to hear, how do you coach people through this? Because sometimes it can seem like a no-win game.
Let me touch on the last part. The answer is yes, Scott. I have had other instances. Throughout my career, there's been times, I would say, especially as a mother, been a lot of times where, and I distinctly remember a year ago, actually, that we had the biggest conference. I actually just put, by the way, a LinkedIn post about this. We had one of our biggest conferences for our company, and I was a presenter in that conference. And the feeling that I got of, what do I do with this situation? Because I can't not be there for my son. Like, that was not even an option. But I also knew that I just felt in my soul that I would get judged, that people would be like, we can't believe that as a vice president, you're not here the entire week. And the reality is it wasn't quite that bad. I might have made it a little bit worse in my head, but that's an example of other times that I was out of alignment that caused the burnout, right? And so how do you coach people through it? I think this is really, there's no one answer through that. Look, there's all kinds of research on burnout and there's all kinds of advice on burnout. But what I find with my clients, and I actually am coaching somebody right now through this, I find that there's a lot of times a belief that is holding them to a standard that's not realistic. And you have to dig deep into what are those beliefs so that we could start to change the way that we approach how we work. We start to kind of change the way, and like, do you even know what your values are? I have a different client that we did a values exercise because it wasn't clear to that client what their values were. And so think of it as like, it's a path you have to walk on together, right? And for me as a coach, my job is to try to help you navigate that path and figure out what is that thing that's keeping you from getting relief. Because at the end of the day, we all have choices and we have to recognize that we have choices.
That's so true. And I love that you're helping your clients get underneath the surface level, because oftentimes, and I know for women especially, we don't even recognize that we're in burnout until we're already on so far deep into it. And then we're just trying to tread water until we figure out how to get our way out of it. So I love that you're helping them to understand the beliefs underneath so they can start to shift. So I'm curious, now that you've stepped outside of the formal corporate system, Nadine, what's your mission as a coach?
I love that you use the word system, Monica, because that's at the heart of why I decided to become a coach. We all operate, I had this recognition that we all operate within a system. And for some people, when you're the only or when you're the minority in the workplace, that system might not always serve them, right? They start to second guess themselves. They form beliefs like we talked about that don't serve them. They don't feel like that they belong. And so for leaders, especially, this can look like an inauthenticity or a lack of empathy, right? And how you show up in the workplace. I just had this recognition, I think, when I was in corporate, that I can't change the system all by myself. But what I can do is help one person at a time. I love the challenge of helping clients get unstuck in whatever it is that they're doing, right? It could be topics like burnout. It could be topics around decisions that they have to make in the workplace. A lot of it comes down to confidence and how you feel, your sense of belonging. There's a lot that's underneath that we have to get to, but senior leaders tend to they're the ones navigating a lot of complexity. And for me, it's how do I help them feel unstuck in the midst of this complexity that they live in?
Nadine, I know I speak for many of your current clients and your future clients when I say that you starting your coaching practice is truly a gift to the world. And I know that we're going to have a lot of listeners who have listened to your own personal journey and have been very intrigued by it and might be interested in contacting you to see about working with you. What's the best way that they can do that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the kind words. So if anybody's interested in talking to me, probably the easiest way is just to email me. My email address is Nadine at insightexeccoaching.com. Nadine spelled Nadine. You can find me on LinkedIn. So if you just search my name, I don't think there's another Nadine Fakhoury out there. So you can find me there. And then my website's actually being built out right now. So eventually you'll be able to go to insightexeccoaching.com. Look for that later this fall. And you can find me there as well.
And we will have all of your contact information on our show notes page on our website. And so if you need any of that contact information, just go ahead and navigate over to unityandcompany.com/podcast. And you can get all the information there on how to reach out to Nadine and inquire about potentially working with her. So I'd like to end our conversation today by just thanking everybody for tuning in to our enlightening conversation with Nadine Fakhoury. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. And if you're interested in Unity & Company and the work that we do, you can drop us a line at info@unityandcompany.com, and we will reach out to you and connect. We'd love to do so. We'll catch you all next time. Thanks for tuning in.